welcome to the channel. My name is Joe, and I want to tell you about a railroad that I've always loved for most of my life, and that is the Delaware and Hudson. When I was a little kid, I had heard about the big railroads such as Norfolk Southern, Canadian Pacific, BNSF, CSX, and etc. I remember going trackside for the first time when I was little, and there was no trespassing signs from the two previous owners of the line that I lived on. There was a Norfolk Southern sticker on the signal bundle, a Canadian Pacific one, and an interesting one that I've never seen before. It was for the Delaware and Hudson Railroad Corporation, and that piqued my interest from there. What was the Delaware and Hudson Railroad, and why have I never heard of it before? Well, after a little research, I discovered that the Delaware and Hudson used to run the line I lived on, which is the Susquehanna Division of the D&H. It was originally built as a broad gauge railroad in 1851 by the Albany and Susquehanna, and they reached Binghamton in 1869 with the line starting in Albany, New York. It was leased by the Delaware and Hudson and then fully controlled by the Delaware and Hudson in 1870. And from 1870 to 1991, D&H trains ran through my hometown and my home line. And after more research on the D&H, simple things like their paint scheme attracted me, which is still my favorite one, the lightning stripe scheme. As you can see here, got a U30C. We'll get to that guy real shortly. A C420 and an RS36 hiding behind the tower there. It's a striking paint scheme, and here's a real picture of one. Also, I used to hear stories all the time about how people would get on the train here in Bainbridge and ride up the line. I would hear stories, not of Canadian Pacific or Norfolk Southern, who would later run trains through here, but of the Delaware and Hudson. Now, people remember seeing the D&H line side and all the local businesses they used to serve. For me being born in the mid-2000s, I never got to see the D&H in operation. I've always been with Canadian Pacific and Norfolk Southern to this day, and maybe Union Pacific here shortly. But I never got to see the D&H and their amazing lightning stripe paint scheme, or any of the other paint schemes such as blue dip and tiger stripe. So I always wondered, what would the D&H paint scheme, the lightning stripe in particular, would look like on a modern day diesel? Fast forward to October of 2024, and Norfolk Southern released a Facebook post asking for their fans to vote on their next Heritage Unit. One of the options was the Delaware and Hudson, and oh my goodness, it got a lot of support. There was another contender that was getting a lot of support, and that was the Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. Both sides fought for their Heritage Unit to be painted, and I was pretty confident that D&H was ahead. Even AI was confident that D&H was ahead. Well, come early December, and I would awake to the Tennessee and Alabama and Georgia sitting outside the Altoona shops. I was heartbroken, along with many of my friends and other rail fans in the D&H community. It looked to be a curtain close, and the end of our chances of having a D&H Heritage Unit. We had asked online, will we ever get a D&H Heritage Unit? Will we ever see the lightning stripe or any of the D&H's paint schemes on a modern day diesel, or preserved even more? It went silent, but then in June of 2025, Norfolk Southern would release this. the Altoona shops in Pennsylvania would release their 22nd Heritage Unit. It would be NS SD-78's 1080 getting the honors to wear the paint scheme of the lightning stripe for the D&H. I was excited and I knew I just had to go see this thing somehow. If I had to move heaven and earth to go see it. My opportunity came in early August. I had gotten word that the 1080 was leading northbound manifest train H60 from Enola Yard in Pennsylvania to Binghamton Yard in Binghamton, New York. It was on the head of this train, and it had a long ways to go to get to Binghamton. I made an attempt to go to Binghamton, more specifically Conklin, to see the train pull in to its destination. Remember that Maersk SD-40 that I documented, the NS-3329? While that unit was cool, that was not the unit I was after though that day. Unfortunately, Norfolk Southern would send southbound counterpart train H61 south, and that would stop the H60, the one that the 1080 was on, in Hot Bottom, Pennsylvania, where it was the first passing loop past Binghamton. And unfortunately, me working night times meant I had to go to bed real shortly, and I missed the 1080 coming into Binghamton on that day. Unfortunately, me working nights meant I missed that night's K31, which is a nightly manifest train from Binghamton, New York to Montreal, Quebec, Canada. And 1080 was in charge of the train that night, and it led the first train over the D&H Susquehanna Division. It wasn't over for me yet though, as I knew that all Norfolk Southern power on this train had to return south. And so it did. On August 11th, 2025, 1080 was returning south on train K30, the southbound counterpart to the K31. It had some ways to get to me though. It was in Saratoga around 11 that morning and received a new crew by 1 p.m. Things were looking promising. However, the thing that plagued me before was about to plague me again, and that was going to work that night. And it was getting close to evening hours by the time 1080 would get to me. Me and my friend Ethan Monroy, you may know him as XT Brat, were originally waiting on the Oneonta Bridge at Pony Farm Road to get the 1080 coming south. My plan was to chase the 1080 as far as I could before I had to get called into work. However, 1080 would never reach the bridge before I got to work, as right before they hit Oneonta, they lost air pressure in their system, meaning that the brakes could slip on, and so the 1080 came to a stop in Oneonta Yard. Thankfully, where it stopped, we could access and see the Heritage Unit. And when I drove into the yard, it was just a real moment. It almost didn't feel real. With the Delaware and Hudson Heritage Unit parked in the former D&H yard here in Oneonta, let's talk about the history of the D&H. The Delaware and Hudson Corporation was formed as the D&H Canal Company in 1823, hauling boats up and down the canals that they own, mostly going to the New York City markets. In 1829, the D&H would introduce steam locomotives to the United States. Originally, the steam locomotives were going to be used for the purpose of hauling canal boats up and down the canals, not as a railroad. But by the 1860s, railroads were gaining in popularity across the country. The D&H wanted to crack into this market. In 1864, they acquired the Erie Jefferson Division from Lanesboro, PA, down to Carbondale, PA. In 1870, the D&H would gain control of the Albany and Susquehanna Railroad. The Albany and Susquehanna would give the D&H a main line between Binghamton and Albany, New York. And just for reference, the 1080 right now is sitting on the former Albany and Susquehanna. In 1886, the D&H would crack into the Canadian market, reaching Montreal. On November 5th, 1891, the D&H abandoned the canals, as railroads were their primary focus from here on out. In the first half of the 20th century, more acquisitions began happening. The D&H began taking over more railroads, and more territory was gained. In 1912, a new shop site was constructed to handle larger locomotives on the north side of the Albany and Waterville. This was known as the Colony Shops. It was constructed on 1,100 acres of land for $2.5 million and eventually employed 2,500 people. Thereafter, the obsolete repair facilities at Green Island were downgraded. The Colony Shops would become the D&H's main repair facility. In 1938, the D&H started to act as a bridge line carrying large amounts of freight between other connecting lines. Come the 1940s, and traffic on the D&H increased with the wartime traffic. Troops had to be moved, and freight was needed for the war effort. After the war, like most railroads, the D&H's traffic began to decline. Passenger trains dropped dramatically in service, and some help was going to be needed for freight traffic. In 1964, the Norfolk and Western filed an application to purchase the Nickel Plate Road and the Wabash Railroad. The Interstate Commerce Commission approved their purchase under the condition that they would take over the D&H and Erie-Lackawanna. N&W would put the EL and D&H under their new holding company, Doreco, and the D&H company was recognized as the Delaware and Hudson Railway following the bankruptcy of numerous northeastern U.S. railroads in the 1970s, including EL. Unfortunately, N&W lost Doreco stock. After several merger plans fell through, EL petitioned for and became included in the formation of the federal government's Consolidated Rail Corporation, Conrail. The D&H was left out of the formation of Conrail, as the northeastern railroads were hoping that the D&H, being alongside Conrail, would create competition. While the D&H was still owned by N&W, they were given no financial support. They were told to sink or swim by the N&W, and they were left high and dry. In 1976, Conrail was formed. At the time, the D&H had some money-making trains, such as the Sealand Land Bridge trains. Unfortunately, Conrail saw that the Sealand Land Bridge trains were making money for the D&H, and Conrail took the Sealand trains, and some other high business trains as well. That was another money loss for the company, for the D&H. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, the D&H was struggling financially. Track maintenance was being overlooked and not being done to save money, and paint being applied to new locomotives was either a step down in design, and the paint itself was very cheap and wore off. This would be known as the Blue Dip era, as instead of locomotives being painted in the famous lightning stripe scheme, they were painted in the simplified Blue Dip scheme. In the early 1980s, the D&H's Penn Division was in a sad state. The Penn Division ran from Nineveh, New York, down to Scranton, PA. The D&H was looking for a new way to get into the Pennsylvania market. Luckily, they found one, as Conrail in 1980 would sell off their former DL&W main line from Binghamton down to Sunbury. All Penn Division trains would be moved from the Penn Division over to the DL&W line out of Binghamton. And in the mid-1980s, the Penn Division was abandoned altogether, except for the part between Carbondale and Scranton. That is still operated by the Genesee Valley's Delaware Lackawanna today. Also in the mid-1980s, Guilford Transportation took over and purchased the D&H as part of a plan to operate larger regional railroads together to make money off one another. The D&H was in such poor condition that Guilford only purchased them for $500,000. Unfortunately for Guilford, with the D&H already having very little freight traffic, they filed the D&H on June 20th, 1988 for bankruptcy. In 1988, the Interstate Commerce Commission opted to arrange for the D&H to be absorbed into Conrail. However, Walter G. Rich, the president and CEO of the New York, Susquehanna, and Western Railway, quickly lobbied against the arrangement since the D&H had a contract in place to jointly operate intermodal trains with the NYSW and CSX Transportation. The Federal Bankruptcy Court agreed to appoint the NYSW to assume control of the D&H until another buyer could be found. The buyer wouldn't come until 1991, when Canadian Pacific Railway purchased the D&H for $25 million to provide a connection between Montreal and New York City area. The Canadian Pacific would receive all of D&H's equipment and rolling stock, infrastructure, and they would phase out the D&H name entirely. The D&H had become CP Rail. Canadian Pacific did well to keep up with the D&H. Traffic was still flowing, but local customers were closing their doors. Over the years, less and less trains ran. During Canadian Pacific's tenure, another company was running their trains over the D&H. This company was Norfolk Southern. They were running intermodal trains due to trackage rights over the D&H. And eventually, in 2015, Norfolk Southern would purchase the D&H from Canadian Pacific, but not the whole thing. Norfolk Southern now operates the D&H from Saratoga Springs, New York, down to Sunbury, Pennsylvania. Norfolk Southern has been the operator of the D&H for the past 10 years, since September of 2015. As of 2025, the Albany and Susquehanna portion of the D&H sees 4 manifest trains and 2 intermodal trains, and 1 monthly grain train, and on a few occasions, they'll even call out a local train to serve McDowell and Walker and Lutz Feed. The line between Binghamton and Sunbury sees 2 road trains, manifests, and 1 turn job a day. After 10 years of owning the D&H lines, Norfolk Southern finally did a D&H Heritage Unit on June 4th, 2025, with SD70 Ace 1080 being the one to honor the D&H. Then ever since then, she's been on the rails, hauling freight and the occasional special train. However, the D&H is not remembered by its failures. It's remembered by its innovations, its people, paint schemes, and locomotives. And the D&H will live forever as long as it remains in everyone's heart. And that is how the Delaware and Hudson is a Norfolk Southern predecessor. Sounds K30 through downtown Bainbridge on August 12th, 2025, 8:31 p.m. Here comes the FRA track geometry train led by NSSD-70 Ace 1188. Alrighty, the geometry train should be coming its way. We're gonna do a going away shot here. So the train's coming up from behind you, and you're gonna see him go down there. See if we see anybody singing in the back. And just like that, it's over. Nobody's sitting in the back of it. Cool, that's got marker lights though. Just like a passenger train. gotta love my tripod. That's 11R 6953 on the point. SD78 1212 in the middle, and I believe C6M 4597 trailing. Lots of empty racks on this guy's bottom end today. Here comes train 11R coming into Afton here. You can see McDowell Walker has a hopper there. There's another one at the facility itself. This 11R here has two SD70 Aces, an SD60, and an AC44 C6M. I don't know if they're meeting anybody here or not. They originally had an approach, but it's been upgraded to a clear signal here. So I don't know if anyone's saying on the siding, but I think this is going to be a one and done train. For us, no chase. I also don't want to go south in case there is a northbound sitting in the siding like 16R, so we'll see what happens here. he goes around the bend. SD70 Ace 1188 is on the point, turning back south after leading the FRA geometry train. This time it's a lot heavier load than the last train this thing took. Alrighty, we beat 16R here to Walnut Ave at milepost 580.71. So here he comes. I imagine he's not crawling anymore, but I guess we'll find out. Beat him here with no problem, too. Alright, there's 16R. He's all empty trash, and he's got new cars and trucks and auto racks and SUVs. Love bug. Comes Norfolk Southern southbound intermodal train 265 bound for Chicago. Apparently this guy has a -9 44CW trailing. Not too many of those left in 2025. This is supposedly the 9841. So let's check it out. car didn't cut you guys off. Sorry if it did. I guess I'll check the footage later. It's Norfolk Southern southbound manifest train K30. He's got NS 1080, the D&H Hudson Heritage Unit trailing, riding on home rails on the former D&H Susquehanna Division. There goes K30. Man, again, what a dream come true. Seeing Bainbridge, Afton, and I think I haven't seen any of it on social media, so I could be wrong, but me, Luke, and there was someone else here. We are the first ones to see it over the trestle, or get footage and documentation of it over the trestle. And there are plenty of photos of D&H lightning stripes crossing this very same bridge. So, just unreal. It really is. Even though it's trailing, but, well, the real life lightning stripes had the trail too. So, I'm honestly not that bothered by it trailing. And there's a fly causing the camera to go out of focus.